So, by way of self-introduction, I would like to ask you, one at a time, um, in your roles, how do you relate to arts and culture and your community?
So I think I should first say that I don't consider myself an artist, nor do I consider myself a culture bearer. Um, I work for a nonprofit organization in Little Tokyo, which is primarily a social service and community development organization. And so we've been engaged in creative placemaking. Some people call it creative placekeeping work. Over probably the past, really kind of intensely over the past 5 or 6 years. And I've had the privilege to be able to lead part of that work for the past 3 years or so. And I think that through that work, we've really seen ourselves and kind of our role within the community and our role within this ecosystem of a neighborhood, Little Tokyo, which is really rich with history and culture and creativity and actual real artists. And so, our role through that, through this work has evolved over time. So, I think that my role is interesting in that I tend to facilitate and try to connect artists and connect our community development work with the work of the artists and culture bearers in our community.
Same here. I actually came to SOMA 25 years ago as a student filmmaker when I was a student at UCLA, and that's how I fell in love with the South market. But I don't consider myself an artist, but similarly, the work of the cultural district is really supporting our artists, our arts institutions, organizations, but also the life and culture of the community. I do want to acknowledge Alleluia Panis, who's our legacy artist and choreographer here in SOMA, Pilipinas. You saw her in the film, and she's been doing this amazing work presenting contemporary and also tribal Filipino arts for decades. So I feel underqualified to be here, but we really want this to be a community discussion and with all of you, and then also artists and community leaders in the room. Also want to recognize Desi Dangadan, who's the director of Cultivate, who presents the creative night markets here in the South Market to support small businesses in the arts.
Hi, Josué from the Mission, and being from the Mission, I guess I'm really lucky that there's something in the water. I am a product of the Mission. I'm a product of the Mission in the sense that arts and culture was really steeped into my education, my formation, every walk down the street. I was surrounded with murals and music and food, and so I am a participant in that, so I'm a practicing artist. I also am executive director of Acción Latina, and Acción Latina is a legacy nonprofit, and we publish El Tecolote newspaper, and we're at kind of a really amazing historical moment. El Tecolote, I brought a nice fat stack for us. There's a bunch in the front, but El Tecolote is turning 50 years old in 2020.
Wow.
And that is a huge testament to people power. We've been able to do it on a volunteer basis for that entire time. It's always been free and bilingual, and because it's 50 years and it's still around, that makes it the longest continuously running bilingual Spanish and English paper, not just in the city, not just in the state, but in the whole Southwest. And so we're really, really proud of that fact. And I can go on for a little bit, but we also have an art gallery space that we show local artists. I mean, we love the fact that San Francisco is become a hub for artists and always has been, but we really feel conviction in showing our local flair and flavor and some of our local talent. We also put together a music festival called the Encuentro del Canto Popular, that is a tradition in and of its own. It's 38 years old. And so, I think as an artist and as a bearer of culture, we really feel it's important to put our folks on. And also, one piece that's really important about having something like a newspaper that has this incredible memory is we can look back at 50 years of our archive. And so the Chronicle, the Examiner, they do not have anything on us historic-wise. And so it's really important for us to be able to have this archive. And when people write books and when people want to know about our community, we hold that. And so that's a really huge key thing for us.
I'm actually hardly a cultural bearer myself. I started this work from affordable housing finance. I know it's a pretty long road to tell the story about how I started a film festival, but really it's wanting to elicit the help of filmmakers to explain and to inspire folks to really learn about their city and to support equity and justice. So I started a film festival. Isn't that what you do? I don't know. So I wanted to work in affordable housing because I wanted to create housing for everyone, because I wanted to create thriving neighborhoods. Then I realized that most folks don't actually understand what affordable housing is, and we don't actually have a lexicon or an imagery or mythology or stories around what affordable housing is, until priced out, of course. So I went into cultural programming to start those stories, to start to have a platform to tell the stories. And when we started talking about putting this event together, we were thinking, well, there's a lot of good things, and maybe there's a lot of risks in highlighting cultural legacy, history, arts. Sometimes it can get co-opted. And what are those instances? How do you think that actually happens, and why are we even talking about it?
Can we start over there?
Well, more, I guess, context is, part of putting together this this film showing and panel with Urban Film Festivals to really explore these issues, these questions that's coming up in our community. And so, because unlike Calle 24 or Little Tokyo, we actually have a lot of work to be done to develop our commercial corridor, brings Filipino small businesses back into the Southern market, as well as create public art and placemaking. So while we're in this process of pushing the city to develop special crosswalks on 6th Street, Folsom and Howard, special, designing special bike racks. We have Mike Arcega designing one right now. More murals and artwork. There is a question in our community that we would love to learn from, whether it be the Mission or Little Tokyo, is there a risk as you kind of, improve the neighborhood, provide more art, that it will be commodified and, be used to sell your neighborhood to other people and then to price, people out?
So, it's an interesting question, and it's really interesting that you started by framing it around affordable housing, because in some ways I think that the affordable housing industry itself has been co-opted, and I think that, in LA at least, we are among very few community-driven, community-based, or neighborhood-based developers of affordable housing at Little Tokyo Service Center. And I think that the roots of the affordable housing industry, as I understand it, are really in kind of a social justice movement. And so I think that the industry itself has really shifted to be driven by production and number of units. And I think that if you're not doing things within a neighborhood context, that you run the danger of transforming neighborhoods, still without, keeping the folks that were living there previously in there, right? And I think that, so the importance of the work of creative placekeeping is really about, ensuring that that movement still remains kind of as a community-driven movement that retains the culture and identity of a certain neighborhood, and that, in our work, we can approach that comprehensively through the production of affordable housing, but also, building this ecosystem of arts and culture bearers and supporting the existing folks that are in place that are doing that work already and partnering with them in different ways. But then also providing social services and doing community organizing, supporting the small businesses, and building a neighborhood more holistically. I don't know if I answered your question, Faye, I'm sorry. But I'm going to pass the mic so I can stop talking anyway.
Thank you. I remember seeing when some of these big, I think it was the Vita apartment, I'm calling them out, the Vita apartments on 20, right next to the New Mission Theater. It had these huge billboards and it says, "Come experience the Mission." And it had all these murals, and they were using people's murals to sell these apartments. And I've definitely been around painting murals. I was working on one in Balmy Alley, and lo and behold, I had to take out my earphones. I looked behind me, and it was someone dressed in safari gear, driving a safari Jeep-like vehicle, and speaking into a mic about here's one in their real habitat doing this thing, and I'm just I couldn't even, as the millennials say, and this is a reality, and it does happen, and I think we have to be really intentional about holding our space, and even some of the people who are doing these foodie tours and these mural tours, just be aware, and don't do a mural tour unless it's from Precita Eyes. If you're going to book something for your schools, ensure that it's community institutions that are doing it. Go out and explore yourself. Don't take a foodie tour. I mean, I don't know what else to say, but just to really just be mindful and be mindful with folks. And I think, we can go on for a really, really long time. But firstly, I want to just say shout out to SOMA and SOMA Pilipinas for doing some amazing work. I just can't say enough. You're doing some really incredible stuff, and Undiscovered, and all these amazing artists that are being put on, and it's just the soul of San Francisco is such a powerful. I went to Potrero Hill Middle School, and so all of my homies were from SOMA and the Mission, and we just grew up together, and I just have such love for this part of town. I'm really happy to be here.
So we do these things at SF Urban Film Fest, and we call them prep calls. So during the prep call, we had Scott Oshima, and we had this question about how do we mitigate some of the effects of consumerism or consumption of arts and culture. And some of the things that he mentioned was really control the narrative, control the story. So you're running a newspaper for 24 years. That's controlling the story of your community. He also talked about that in Little Tokyo you have public art guidelines that you hand to developers. Do you want to talk more about that?
I chose the wrong seat. So I was going to amend my kind of previous statement to also talk a little bit about authenticity and kind of as a community developer and as a community organizer, our role and our work in arts is really about ensuring that the folks that are telling the story of Little Tokyo, are the folks that have been part of that community and have lived that experience. We have let's see, how do I do this in not 2 hours. One of there's this thing called the Little Tokyo Community Council, which is a body that consists of a number of different stakeholders, about 150 stakeholders, who are businesses, nonprofit organizations, community institutions, and they are kind of tasked with creating a unified front for the community and kind of dictating as much as we can a show of solidarity in terms of power. And so one of the things that they've developed is community art guidelines or guidelines for public art, which they've adopted and have shared with the council office and the neighborhood council. And so really kind of draw their power from the council office that will refer anybody who wants to do public art in Little Tokyo to get approval from the community council. And I mean, the guidelines speak to process and how a piece of art is created, and how an artist will work with community to ensure that the narrative that whatever piece of art they're creating is authentic and reflective of kind of our values, and hopefully doesn't lead to gentrification. And I think that one of the things that we've talked a lot about is that a mural can be any number of things kind of based on the process of how it's developed. It could be a piece of art that makes a building look pretty. It can be a piece of art that tells a story of a community. It can be a piece of art that really holds place, that is kind of like putting a flag down and saying, look, this is Little Tokyo. This is the story of our community. This is the story of our struggle. And if you come here, there's another saying in Little Tokyo that's, welcome to Little Tokyo. Please take your shoes off. And it's really about kind of the narrative there is, we are a welcoming community, but it's important to also respect our values and respect our culture. And so if you're going to come here, you're welcome in our house, but remember it's our house, and also take your shoes off and, contribute, right? And so, it's with that kind of intention that we've created guidelines for folks who want to come into the neighborhood and do work here and create art in this neighborhood, and to varying degrees of success.
Raquel, maybe you can talk about the history of the Filipino American community and why a cultural district.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, we've, in my welcome, I mentioned that we've been here 120 years. We, have our roots. We've actually been literally here for 120 years. Like on Minna Street, there was like a men's association house that was found, and you chronicled in the SF Chronicle back in the days. But most people know we trace our roots also to Manila Town, which was 10 to 12 blocks over where near the financial district, Chinatown, where we had the Manongs, the first wave of Filipinos who came, who were basically recruited to work as farm workers and in the canneries. So in their twilight years, they lived in SROs in Manila Town, but when Transamerica, when basically the financial district expanded, that whole place was demolished. And the last stand was the I Hotel, which was in the 70s, pretty incredible fight. If you don't know, the history, it's probably the most iconic tenant right. It actually gave birth to the tenant rights movement in San Francisco, and you had even. For a short time, the sheriff at the time refusing to evict the elderly, mostly men, Filipino and Chinese men there. And the sheriff himself was thrown in jail for doing that, But eventually, it was demolished. So that was in the 70s. But in the 80s, after we have a lot of Filipino families settling here in the South Market. And since then, I think in the price out, you have the history of cities, and this used to be much more industrial, right? So we didn't have parks, we didn't have schools, and it was really the Filipino community who really pushed to build, rebuild New Bessie as a real school versus bungalows, World War II bungalows, build our park, Victoria Manalo Draves Park. And one of the most recent struggles and victory we had just last year around this time was when a luxury development was going to be built and shadow the park half the year. And the community came together to oppose that. But we were scolded by the mayor and city hall for opposing housing. And they said, don't we need housing, and build. And so that's, part of the narrative that's why price out is so important, because we need to challenge this notion of building at all costs, or the more we build, the more there'll be housing for everyone. When the truth is, it's, housing is for profit, versus a human right. So that's part of the narrative we're trying to change here in SOMA. So I don't know if that's the whole. So that so that's we're here. We're trying to be here, but we're also trying to bring back businesses that were displaced. We're trying to bring back communities and families that were pushed out. We're trying to, build a new culture, because when we talk about, like culture, we have a colonial culture with the U.S. And so part of, like with SOMA Pilipinas, I think when we did our branding, we said, we don't want to replicate kind of, that kind of colonial feudal culture that we bring from our homeland. We want to create a new culture that's progressive, that's, about, of course, our roots, but also our experiences and struggles here in San Francisco and the U.S. So it's all that, but I think also figuring out all those things. And so, the question is like, given like also the mission and the displacement of Latinos, something like 8,000 Latinos in, the last few years, like, what was the root of that, right? Was our, of course, housing, affordable housing, real estate speculators. Was there a role that the art played in it or not, Like, what does that mean for us? Do we not create art? Do we not build murals? Do we not tell our stories? So those are kind of the questions that we're grappling with as a community right now.
I think this is all conversations that we really do need to be having. And I think as we see this huge trend citywide and statewide and actually countrywide in the United States of cultural districts, I really think that it really should be that no two are unique. And I think it really is a challenge to each community to participate in these cultural districts. Like, no one should be making these decisions for us, right? It's kind of another form of civic engagement. And so each one of these cultural districts has committees around land use, around the arts, around affordable development, around legacy businesses. And so everyone has a role to play in each of those. And I would just urge people, don't let the cultural district decisions be made for us, but to really be active in those. And that is a way of participating in civic engagement. And I think we shouldn't leave any of that, any aspect of any of this in anyone else's hands but ours. And so it's true. And, one thing that I also learned, I have a pretty good lawyer. And, some of these tech companies showed up and wanted to take pictures of my mural, and I got all my stuff copyrighted right away. It was worth the $200, $300. And I would just tell, as you build as we build this up, like, tell artists that they have these, that you have rights. Copyright your stuff. You know what I mean? If anybody wants to use my stuff, okay, firstly, pay me. Secondly, pay me. Also, before you do those things, you got to get my permission. And so I think all of these things really do, it's almost like chess. You protect each move. And I think it's really important for us to really see that as artists, as creators, and as, as people in these communities, real people, right? That's the other part. I was looking at these films, and man, it was so beautiful to see our sheroes and our heroes, right? People who are fighting fierce and who have fought fiercely, and seeing some of these veteranos really getting their shines. And it's just like this it really is a reminder that the heroes of our community are really the people that are sitting next to you, right? The people who work and drive the buses and have been fighting these fights for a long time, and to really honor that. I think it's just so beautiful to see. Oh, yeah. So Acción Latina, one of the things that's really incredible, speaking of everyday heroes, is we are one of the legacy spaces that is basically unevictable because we own our space. And so that's such a huge... It's such a huge gift because the founders of El Tecolote, they bought that space back in 2000, and so we just can't be moved, and it's such an honor to be able to say that. And so even the work that we're now building, we want to do lots of pollinating and cross-promoting with communities. We're able to do that because we have this home base, and we're right in the heart of the cultural district, and so that's really a huge thing. So. Buy land, I guess, is a lesson.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to audience questions, and Emery Douglas says that he's willing to answer your questions as well, and everybody else up here too. Any questions? Okay, well, I have a question. Oh, there you go. Susie? Susie?
I guess I wonder, also like the Castro Cultural District, the Mission, all of these places are having this kind of like the art is there or the representation, but the housing, is there a way that any of you know that you can have those housing demands brought into the cultural district rules that are happening in San Francisco?
Thank you. Actually, we work with a coalition of cultural districts in San Francisco, and want to recognize Nina, who is the project manager for Japantown Cultural District, which is the oldest cultural district in San Francisco. In terms of, we are actually in the, so when we first, for SOMA Pilipinas, it was recognized in 2016 by a resolution of the board, but really, it had no teeth, because, when I started in 2017, you had the Central SOMA Plan, which basically, it was this plan to redevelop the whole South of Market to build a ton of office space and hotel space, hotel units, and while they recognized the cultural district, there was no teeth. And so in 2017, we actually worked to pass an ordinance that required the city recognizing the value of cultural districts as particularly an anti-displacement tool for cultural preservation. And we're in the process of developing our strategies, which will crafting, as we speak, and then present it to the board for adoption. So it's an effort to try to codify kind of what are the strategies that not only our communities see fit, but also to hold the city accountable to it. But I think with how city hall politics work, it's not as easy as convincing, Mayor Chen in the praised out, right? Like she looked in the mirror and teared out. Yeah, so it's a lot more than that. But yeah, it is a lot of the work of our cultural district is around policy advocacy and community organizing.
Hi, thank you. This has been great. I would like to know what your thoughts were about the film addressing Boyle Heights and the people who were agitating against the galleries. Simple. I don't know. Where do you go with that? Let's open that conversation up, because I think it's just indicative of people fighting maybe amongst themselves in ways that maybe there's a bigger issue to address. That was sort of my takeaway on it, but please, thoughts.
I would have loved to have seen some dialogue between the two groups. I think I, as an artist, very often feel like that artist felt, right? Kind of right in the middle. And so I think that would have been really, really fruitful if people would have just would have talked. I think it's just important to be heard and to be listened to, and people are rightfully angry. I think if you're not angry, something's wrong. There's a lot of stuff that's wrong in the world, and it should incite righteous indignation. And I see that with people, so I can relate. I can relate immensely. But at the exact same time, you have to really figure out how to maximize that. And I thought it was a really key document. I don't know if I have the answers, but I think that's important to document those feelings.
Yeah, I think the question, I'm from Los Angeles. I worked on the whole project in Boyle Heights, and I think what happened there is that it got out of control. Because after a while, they're slamming everybody. They're slamming Marie Cabil, they're building affordable housing. They're slamming Rudy Espinosa for doing street vending work. They're slamming everybody. And what happened was that narrative became very visual and very powerful, like jazz hands. So that became the whole story of everything. So therefore, it became a very toxic zone that nobody wanted to enter in. So, and now that the galleries are shut down now, but now they're event spaces for Hollywood people. So they didn't change anything. Now it's just the new people coming in there doing Hollywood production parties in these spaces.
Hollywood people.
Yeah.
So the galleries are gone, and the Hollywood is coming in and using the empty spaces to create movie sets.
Now it's big money.
Big money, even more money. Maybe they're employing people. Okay.
So actually, I think James is right, but I think it's also what was I going to say? The defend groups, I think, are really, really interesting, and I think I would agree that a lot of their tactics ultimately have been kind of wrong-headed, and particularly and personally, like they lost me when they went after groups like Self-Help Graphics and East LA Community Corporation. But that being said, the way that they've controlled narrative and the way that they've told stories and the way that they've pushed the conversation around gentrification, I think is really remarkable. And the way that they've held space in Boyle Heights and East LA, whether or not the results have been what we would hope for, I think that you also can't discount that. And so I think that it's one of the things that Defend Boyle Heights often will say is that if you say it's complicated, you're missing the point. But I think it's really complicated, and I think that it's a really nuanced conversation that needs to happen. But at the same time, like I have a hard time discounting them, and I think that there's probably also generational aspects at play, and because it's a lot of young folks, and to me young, and I also feel like it's important to recognize that and to hold that up in its own way.
So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Little Tokyo Service Center and the Japanese Cultural Center, and I think you guys also have a theater. So they also have a nonprofit housing developer, super sophisticated operation where they're basically taking control of all entry points into the community, right? Now they're putting together a funding pool, a finance pool. So they're taking care of the money, they're taking care of the land, they're taking care of the housing, they're taking care of the narrative, they're creating culture. You got all gateways covered. And SOMA Pilipinas is doing that, and Caroline and Josué in the mission are doing that. It is a huge undertaking to create the channels that relate the community back to the entire city, but controlled by the community. Are you? I just want to highlight the breadth and the complexity and the comprehension of the strategies these communities are undertaking.
And it's still really fucking hard.
Caroline?
I mean, I guess I just wanted to share that as a comment, and then ask the question, because I think at Meta, we've been really trying to work through all of the challenges that is happening with the Mission District in terms of keeping our families in place, but also keeping our small business in place, and also keeping all of our arts and cultural organizations in place. And all at the same time, while we know that we actually have a lot of the same politics that Boyle Heights and all of our other communities are facing, where we have different generations, where we have different folks who are coming at how do we solve gentrification, right? And how do we reverse the displacement? And so thank you, Faye, for sharing what Meta's doing, but I actually do want to continue talking and asking about the struggle of we've got a number of different arts and cultural organizations in the Mission District that are fantastic, like Acción and Presita, that we've been able to keep them in place because they've been able to buy. And we've also been struggling with how do we continue to keep other nonprofits and other arts and cultural organizations in place too. And so we've been asking ourselves, what does make a cultural placekeeper, and how do you decide what is a cultural placekeeper? What we've come up with is that they have to be rooted in the Mission District. They have to have a legacy of serving our Latino residents, because it is about what is the Mission District, and they have to have an activist sort of bent to them, so they can't just be like, oh, well, we're serving, but if our mission changed tomorrow, we'd also be serving people who are in the rest of the Bay Area too, because that's what we do, right? And so just curious in terms of, as you guys are continuing to think about culture, how do you think about culture where you're thinking about that the placekeeper part?
Well, I want to give a huge shout out to Carolee and Meda. I also want to give a huge shout out to the San Francisco Arts Commission, who not only we own our space, but it wasn't as cute 15 years ago as it is now, and so now we have this like this forward-facing gallery space, and so we were able to get that through a creative space and other kind of grants. I have to say another thing that's really important. If we're going to go there, if you really want to go into this resistance and social justice, we have to talk about police, and we do have to talk about the cultural district in a sense, really responsibility to kind of police the police. And I think that's another evolution of this, because my wife put me onto this book with Jenny Odell, the art of doing nothing, or how to do nothing. And it's really awesome for people to think about, I'm gonna just dedicate myself to leisure and hang out in the park. But if you're a person of color, it's not that easy to do. If you're a male of color, they call that loitering. And so I think, some of these parklets and some of these spaces, it's really important for us to talk about who is leisure for. And so in that sense, some of this righteous indignation that I see these young people expressing, it makes perfect sense, and we really need to address it. And since we have a legend in the room, and I really want to talk about this, we had a 50-year anniversary of Los Siete. And Los Siete de la Raza was an amazing movement that galvanized the mission community. And it was about these 7 young Central American men who were accused of killing a police officer. They were acquitted because they were innocent. And the activists that were out to sort of document the story and talk about it, they started the Los Siete newspaper, were out to learn how to make a newspaper, and they shopped around, they went everywhere, like, who's going to teach us, this is 1970, 1968 into 70s, who's going to teach us how to make this newspaper and document this history? No one would mess with it, except for Emory Douglas and the Black Panthers. And so I want to give an acknowledgement and maybe even an invitation to comment, but we really, I mean, even in thinking about some of the movements now and some of the movements in the past, everything from Stonewall to Los Siete to the Black Panthers and even Black Lives Matter, the one string that ties that whole thing together is the way that police have treated people. It's police brutality. And so it's important for us to also, there must be an element at some point in there of policing ourselves. And social justice is a big part, and arts are an expression of those values in many ways. Do you want to say something, Emery? Do you want to say something?
No, I agree with you 100%. We're talking about institutional race exploitation. That's the kind of what this all comes under. We have to change all that. We have to in some kind of way, because as long as that thing that creates the situation for exploitation and everything else, if that's not negated, then whatever we do can always be for little or nothing. Yeah.
So I appreciate that point, Emery, and I think that's, for us as a community, as we're struggling talking about art and culture, why I thought it was really fitting to include Emory Douglas's piece in the clips is when we talk about art, we can't just generalize about art. Not all art is the same or equal, right? And I think someone said earlier, there's art that will beautify, art will tell the story of the community, marketplace. But I think, I was trained by a national artist from the Philippines, Papa de Assis, who comes from like the People's Artist Movement, the anti-martial law movement there. And he did a mural making workshop here in the South of Market in the 90s. And when we were working with a youth and he was teaching, part of people's art and creating people's art is that one, it really should show the authentic experience, life, struggles of the people, but it should also show the solutions to their problems. It shouldn't just talk about the problems and their suffering, but it should also expose like who's causing these problems, and it should also show the solution. And I think that's what's great about the art of Emory Douglas and the Black Panthers, because it's not just like, life sucks, but it's also about like, it's, systematic, it's a system that, that's at play, and who are the players. And so I think, I'm originally from SoCal, and I don't want to venture too much in terms of the Boyle Heights and the elements, because I could imagine also it being exploited, right? To say like, oh, these just to say that these radicals, are just out of control and extremists. But but I do think it's important as a community to name. Like who are we up against, right? Because it's not against each other, It's like artists are not the problem, right? And right, it's it's not the artist that's the problem, right? It's really a system, It's really like what I appreciate about Priced Out is it didn't just talk about what's the problem with the housing crisis. It really educates us on why we can't create enough affordable housing, and why building more and more luxury housing does not solve our problem of houselessness. So I think that's the other piece that legacy of the Black Panthers and Emory Douglas is really how do we use art not just to expose but also to elucidate and to show the way out of our challenges.
So. Caroline, kind of to your original question, I think that it's a complicated and nuanced issue that requires approaches from many different angles. And, you got to think about ownership, control, activism, organizing, policy change, et cetera, right? And we've talked about this many times. I think also that and this is part of why we do creative placekeeping work, and why we feel as an organization that it's so important to be partnering deeply with community and partnering deeply with artists and culture bearers, is that so much of the work that we do around community control of land is about social justice, and it's a movement. And historically, artists and culture bearers have been at the forefront of just about every social movement, right? And I think that one of the important things, at least, and especially related to that campaign and this work that we're doing, is the artist's ability to imagine a different world and a different reality. And when you think about it as people of color who have traditionally been told which boxes we're in and what those boxes look like, our work with artists has allowed us to work with communities of color to re-envision what their communities look like, what their neighborhoods look like, and what they should look like. And also to kind of recognize that the revolutionariness of being and the revolutionariness of like imagining this different future has been really powerful. And I think is, it's important to recognize that in the work that we're doing, but also important to recognize that kind of in the legacies of all these other movements and work that's happened.
I want to say one quick thing, and I think about this all the time, and I think a big part of the role of an artist is to speak up, and a lot of times is going to complicate. We're talking about narratives and taking the narratives into our own hands. It is the role of the artist to complicate that narrative and to throw some nuance into that. And it was Diego Rivera who said, the role of the artist is to be the conscience of their era. And I think that's really, really important, to be the conscience of the times. And I think you're going to have to tell the truth in that sense. I also feel that the artist can be the imagination of their community. And like you're saying, right, we're able to, elucidate, help people imagine something different. I think that's really a huge and key piece, and be able to bring people together and really get people to imagine something that's not quite there yet. But we have to trust artists to do that, right? And one of the things that I do love, I should say, about some of the way that some of these new buildings are being built, there's always kind of this cultural arts component. There is a moment for murals to be built, baked into that process. And I think that's really, really important, and to have local artists in the community to bid for those those contracts. And so that's really, really important to, step into it with the game plan already with these kind of considerations baked in.
I just want to add to that the role of artists for a lot of people of color communities where we don't have historians with PhDs. I've also heard it said that the importance of the role of artists as historians. And so, for us, we actually just recently lost one of our historians, Dan Mabalon, recently. But our artists in the community are telling the stories. Like, if you notice from the video to now, the facade of Bayanihan is very different. And so that was an example of a very much community-driven process led by one of the organizations here, SOMCAN, to survey the community on their top heroes and sheroes of the community, selected them, worked with young people to train them in painting. It was like weeks-long process. But I think that's kind of an example where it's not just creating art, but also training new generation of artists and making those opportunities available. So in our NEA, National Endowment for the Arts the big grant we got from the NEA, we actually are re-granting those by commissioning artists to design plaques and gateways. So we actually have a number of artists that were selected, like Mike Arcega here in this room, to do that. And so part of our, so we are doing some of that, negotiations with developers, both nonprofit and for-profit developers, to include community-based art in their development, not just art, but also public spaces, places that are actually going to be open and friendly to multi-generational Filipinos, so not just like office workers, but, actually the seniors who need recreation, the young people who have been, who don't have like a place to recreate and to find leisure around here. So I think, like Faye says, we are trying to be involved in many different avenues and explore a lot of these strategies. But I wish I would say that that's where we look to the mission, for your experience and the lessons learned. And also we look to Little Tokyo in terms of all the work they're doing. We're nowhere near, it's almost impossible to buy land in SOMA. This place is probably the only, we actually don't even own it. We have probably a lifetime lease on this because it was owned by a Filipino doctor who, worked to preserve this for the community. But we really don't, we are commercial renters and residential renters in this neighborhood. And in this time and age, it's like, how you actually get a foothold anywhere, right? So
I would be remiss if I didn't say this one thing. You guys know the work of this organization called Poder? I would say that we should really support and just do some homework. Just check out what Poder is doing. In the last, I think, 5 to 7 years, they popped up at least 3 parks. So I think in this conversation, again, leisure, who's doing it? How can we, the act of relaxing as resistance. I can go on forever, but green space is enormous, and I think it's really important. Just check out the work of Poder and what that does, and just even the act of replanting native plants from this area and removing gentrifying plants from the area. It welcomes back plants and life and other birds, and it just has this amazing reaction and a chain reaction. So I would say those 2 things, never forget law enforcement and their relationship to the community and who they're serving. And I would say never forget green space, because that's where people are able to stop and imagine and have this leisure and read a book and kick it and put your feet up. And so that also is artsy.
What's the call to action to the folks?
Closing remarks. I would say that with respect to folks who own space and the importance of owning space, and that it cannot be denied, right? However, we have another saying in our work in that, as important as it is to own space, it's also really fundamentally important to control space and control what happens in space, because you can't own everything, and that control comes through policy, it comes through organizing, and it comes through building power within a community, and that's fundamental as well.
So I would say, yeah. So for us, we are trying to own more spaces and figure out different strategies for that. Our plan B is always to occupy spaces and, occupy it with our programming, with our art and culture and activities. And, who cares who owns it, But if we use it, like, the indigenous form of ownership is not like who owns the title to the land, but who actually like cultivates it and has a relationship, with the land. So that's my go-to, because, it's almost impossible to own anything in South Market. But I do just really want to appreciate everyone coming and staying for this forum, and also invite you to participate and get to know more the work of the different organizations here in this room, but also like not in this room, like Moderator. There's a lot of incredible organizations doing work, and whether it be you're in tech or an artist or affordable housing, there's lots of opportunities for partnership as individual organizations. So we invite you to reach out to us and see how we could partner.
I just want to give a shout out. Thank you guys for having me and having this amazing conversation. Aside from the things that I said, green space and watching the police for reals, write it all down. I can't say how incredible it's been. Even right now, where we do we also are very active in the cultural district, and we do the art stroll on the Latino Cultural District, and as we celebrate these 50 years, we're asking people, we're opening up the vaults, as it were, for people to come in and remix and look at the history. And so it's kind of awesome to say, hey, look, there's 50 years of history to check out. And so, you could say, all right, we've been doing this forever. Phil Amstar, a lot of amazing publications, a lot of amazing historians that we have in the room. And so to be able to write it all down is really key. So write it all down. I practice what I preach. Look at this tiny journal I have.
Okay, so that's all the time we have on a Friday night, because it's Friday night. No more wonky stuff. My parting words is really to think about, when you walk out from tonight and into the weekend, what is it that you really love about the city, and how can you take that one little step to take care of it, to cultivate it, to grow it, like a love affair. Thank you.